Chapter 46. You! Klein squatted there, vomiting involuntarily. He was soon done with his puking since he did not eat breakfast at that moment. A tin-colored square flask that looked like a cigarette box appeared in front of him. The mouth, which had lost its stopper, emitted a mixture of smells akin to tobacco, disinfectant, and mint leaves. It cleared up Klein's nose and rejuvenated him. The pungent smell continued to linger, but Klein no longer felt nauseous. He soon stopped vomiting. He traced the tiny flask up and saw a pale hand that did not seem to belong to a member of the living. He saw the mouth of a black windbreaker's sleeve and saw corpse collector Fry with his cold and dark bearing. Thank you. Klein recovered completely, and with his hands on his knees, he stood back up. Fry nodded without any expression. It'll be fine once you are used to it. He put back the flask stopper and put it into his pocket and turned around. Walking to the highly decomposed corpse without gloves, he began examining the old woman. As for Dunn Smith and Leonard Mitchell, they paced slowly around the room, occasionally touching the table's surface or newspapers. Old Neil pinched his nose and stood outside the door, grumbling in a muffled voice, "Seriously gross, I'm going to request for additional pay this month." Dunn turned his head over and touched the wall beside the chimney with his gloved right hand. While doing so, he asked Klein, "Does this place look familiar?" Klein held his breath and constructed the silver pocket watch in his mind to calm down, with him already in his spirit vision state. He immediately felt different. A scene that came from the deepest recesses of his memories flashed past his eyes: chimney, rocking chair, table, newspapers, the rusty nails on the door, the tin cans inlaid with silver. The scenes were dark and dull, like a documentary from Earth. However, it was even more blurry and illusory. The scene quickly stacked against what Klein was seeing. The feelings of déjà vu and having been here before presented themselves clearly. An illusory and ethereal scream seemed to pass through invisible walls. Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. It feels a little familiar, Klein answered honestly while his brain felt a stabbing pain. Thankfully, he quickly tapped his glabella twice. Hornacis. The Hornacis mountain range that appeared in original Klein's diary. That is content that was deciphered from the Antigonus family's notebook. The murmurs were very similar to one of the previous ones. It involved the word Hornacis. Is this a form of enticement? Klein was gripped by shock as he did not dare think deeper. Afraid that he would place himself on the trajectory of losing control, Dunn nodded slightly and walked to a cupboard. He suddenly reached out his hand and pulled open its wooden door. The bread inside was moldy and there were about 7 gray, stiff dead rats. Leonard, go downstairs to get patrolling cops and explain the situation here, instructed Dunn. All right. Leonard turned and left the apartment. Following that, Dunn opened the door to 2 other bedrooms and did a careful search. After being certain that there were no clues as well as any sign of the Antigonus family's notebook, Fry also stood up. He wiped his hands with a white handkerchief he brought along with him and said, "The time of death was more than 5 days ago. There are no external injuries, nor are there any clear signs that it was a result of beyond our powers. The exact cause of death will require a post-mortem. Did you discover anything?" Dunn turned to look at old Neil and Klein. The two, who were no longer in spirit vision state, shook their heads in unison. "Apart from the corpse, everything else is normal. Actually, no, there was an invisible energy sealing the apartment in the beginning. As you know, there will usually be similar processes when we use ritualistic magic." Old Neil thought for a few seconds before adding. Dunn was just about to say something when he looked outside the door. A few seconds later, Klein and old Neil sensed something and turned to look at the stairwell. A few seconds later, faint footsteps grew louder as Leonard walked up with a policeman. The policeman's expression changed once he caught the noxious smell. He immediately cooperated with his colleague from the Special Operations Department and began knocking on the doors of the residents on the 2nd floor to gain an understanding of the situation on the 3rd floor. Moments later, the corporal with his 2 silver chevrons looked at the corpse on the rocking chair. Katie Stephania Bieber, between 55 and 60 years old, widow, has rented this apartment with her son, Ray Bieber, for more than 10 years. Her husband was formerly a gem artisan. Her son is about 30 years old and is single. He inherited his father's trade and earns about £1.15 solely a week, according to their neighbors. They have not seen them in more than a week. Before the policeman continued, Klein already knew the critical point that followed: missing. To be more precise, it was unknown where Ray Bieber had gone to. The ancient notebook could very well be on him. "Do you have a picture of Ray Bieber?" Dunn looked at the police officer. He was acting as the role of a high-ranking inspector. However, it was not really acting since he was indeed a high-ranking inspector on the police department's roster. His salary and various allowances were also paid according to his rank. Of course, it did not include his salary from the church. The police officer shook his head nervously and said, "I'm not sure. They'll have to return to the station to search for it. It's not typical for us to have pictures of every single person. Got it? Continue questioning the residents on the first floor. Ask them in detail." Dunn gave the order. As he watched the police officer leave, he closed the door and turned to old Neil. "I'll leave the rest to you. If not, we will have to make all the residents sleep and obtain Ray Bieber's looks." "Yeah, I don't really trust sketches based on verbal descriptions." Old Neil nodded. He took out a few thumb-sized bottles from a pocket in his black classic robe and scattered the liquids in a particular order. Immediately following that, he pulled out a clump of powder and scattered it in a circle around him. Strangely, a biting smell spread and was not influenced by the nauseating smells in the room. Klein also suddenly noticed that there was an invisible force field around him. It separated him from the environment and everyone else. It was like the room in its previous state. Old Neil half closed his eyes as his lips mumbled a soft and indiscernible incantation. Without being prepared, Klein vaguely heard the words, "Goddess, give me strength. We look forward to the protection of the night." A sudden wind tore through the windows and blew up the powder. Klein's heart quaked suddenly as he felt goosebumps all over him. He found it difficult to describe. A terrifying smell that made him afraid of looking directly spread rapidly. He was confused as he tensed up, unable to relax. It felt as though he had plunged into a state similar to what one would have after working on a highly advanced mathematical problem. Suddenly, old Neil's eyes opened, his eyes pitch black. He took out a fountain pen from his pocket and began drawing on a piece of scrap paper on the table. He was so fast that his entire body was trembling. Klein focused his gaze and saw a face with recessed eyes and a tall nose bridge rapidly appear. When the natural curly short hair was done, old Neil wrote a single line beneath the portrait: black hair, deep blue eyes. Left of his mouth is a fully ceramic tooth implant. Pada. The fountain pen in old Neil's hand fell onto the paper as his body convulsed a few times. "This is the image of Ray Bieber according to what's left in the room," old Neil whispered as the color of his eyes restored rapidly. Then he turned back to his original spot and slowly circled it. The invisible force field that isolated things immediately dissipated in the form of a breeze. "Praise the lady." Old Neil tapped his chest in 4 spots, forming the shape of the crimson moon. Klein's taut nerves relaxed as he made more acute observations. He discovered that there was nothing special about Ray Bieber's facial features. He had a relatively mild bearing. The only thing was that his philtrum sagged clearly. "They'll try using dowsing rod seeking." He picked up the portrait and found male clothes in the bedroom and spread them onto the ground. Dunn, Leonard, and old Neil did not stop him as they watched him place the black cane above the clothes and portrait. Fry was as silent as always. Klein's eyes turned from brown to black as he finished his recitation, only to release his grip. The black cane stood silently like it was embedded in the ground. "Ray Bieber's location," Klein silently repeated to himself. Again, with the sound of humming wind, the cane fell down but kept changing directions while falling. Finally, it began spinning in slight circles. Without any external help, the black cane stood stably again. Klein repeated a few times with the same outcome. All he could do was shake his head at Dunn and old Neil. A strange power was interfering with his divination. Dunn took off his black glove and said to Leonard and Klein, "Take Ray Bieber's portrait and inquire the residents for a final confirmation. Following that, we will issue a warrant of arrest against him for the murder of his mother." "All right." Klein held his cane and bent down to pick the portrait. After the neighbors confirmed that the portrait was indeed Ray Bieber, Dunn instructed Leonard and the police officer to finish the procedures at the station. He and Fry headed to a few bars in Tingen City to seek help via other means. Klein and old Neil returned to Blackthorn Security Company on a public carriage. It was not even 8 by the time they arrived. Roseanne had not even clocked in. After closing the door, Klein cocked his head at old Neil and, hoping to learn and answer his questions, asked him, "Why would I send the Antigonus family's notebook to Ray Bieber's home?" This was completely in a different direction from Iron Cross Street where Welch stayed. Old Neil walked to the sofa and chuckled. "Isn't that obvious? Who knows what power's inside the notebook you invoked? Maybe you did some described ritual out of curiosity and ended up provoking a strange existence that you should not have. The motive of this existence was to have the notebook sent to Ray Bieber and sever all clues to prevent anyone from discovering it. Therefore, apart from you who were selected, Welch and Naya committed suicide. Regarding you, to be frank, I still have no idea how you survived. I would like to know too. Klein sat down as well as he deliberately replied with a wry smile. I've also thought of the guesses you have of the proceedings. However, there's one thing I don't understand. Why did I have to hand the notebook to Ray Bieber? Old Neil shrugged and said, perhaps his life path number 1 matches the requirements, or maybe he's one of the last remaining descendants of the Antigonus family. In short, there are too many possibilities. And why the notebook was sold to Tingen City would have similar reasons. I do not think it's because he's a descendant. Klein suddenly felt enlightened before he sighed. Unfortunately, I did not discover immediately that Ray Bieber and that notebook have vanished. Old Neil laughed. This is something that Dunn has to worry about. As for you, it's something good. Why do you say so? Klein frowned in puzzlement. Chapter 47. Old Neil rubbed his temples and said, I believe we have a general idea of why the 3 of you engaged in a mass suicide. That notebook is also now purportedly in Ray Bieber's hands. Furthermore, the matter has already been exposed. Regardless of whether you are alive or dead, it will hardly influence any subsequent developments. I believe that the surreptitious existence or mysterious power that caused all of this will not pay you any special attention. It's just like how you would not pay attention to the ants on the ground, as long as you do not try to make him recall you, and our arrest warrant for Ray Bieber will quickly reach the secret order. They will also be able to guess that it is related to the Antigonus family's notebook. Believe me, for a secret organization that has been in existence for more than 1,000 years, it has many channels of information. Therefore, their focus will be diverted to Ray Bieber's whereabouts. In a bid to find the notebook before us, they will not. Nor is it possible for them to harass, stalk, or deal with you, lad. Congratulations on stepping out from the shadows of the past. What follows will be a brand new journey filled with sunlight. Klein nodded when he heard that, as he said in a happy and relieved manner, I hope so. Having transmigrated here, he had been enveloped in uncertainty now. It felt like it had finally dissipated. However, Klein was still feeling uncertain because the notebook seemed to be tied to him in a certain manner. It went to the point of him bumping into remnant clues coincidentally from a normal mission of rescuing a hostage. He was afraid that there would come a day when a delivery man would send him a parcel, only to realize that it was that Antigonus family notebook after opening it up. Let's hope everything will go as Old Neil described. He silently prayed. When Old Neil heard his reply, he immediately scoffed. You don't seem to be a devout believer of the goddess. At this moment, shouldn't you be drawing the sign of the crimson moon at your chest and say, may goddess bless us? Mr. Neil, you don't seem like one. Either a real devotee would not say what follows will be a brand new journey filled with sunlight. Having been studying mysticism under Old Neil, Klein had established a decent friendship with him, so he did not stand on ceremony to return a sarcastic remark. Both of them locked eyes and chuckled with great rapport. At the same time, they tapped their chests 4 times. Praise the lady. At that moment, they heard the grinding sounds of machinery as the main door to Blackthorn Security Company opened. The elegant Mrs. Oriana, with her fashionably coiled hair, stepped into the reception hall with a light green dress. Good morning, Mr. Neil. Good morning, Klein. She held a small leather handbag as she greeted with a smile. It's another fabulous day today. A pretty good day. Good morning, Oriana. You are still as beautiful as 10 years ago, replied Old Neil with a chuckle. Oriana's eyes turned to slits as she upturned her face. Mr. Neil, the way you praise is still as infuriating as 10 years ago. She enunciated the words 10 years. Is that so? Old Neil looked at Klein, confused. He wore a perplexed look. Never mention anything that will remind the ladies of their age. As a keyboard warrior that knew a little of everything, Klein instantly understood what had peeved Mrs. Oriana. He smiled lightly and said, Good morning, Mrs. Oriana. You are as beautiful as always. Thank you. Our outstanding Koei University graduate. Oriana smiled with a nod before saying, That old butler has already paid the mission's commission. According to Captain's rules, half of it will be used as additional funds, while the other half will be split between you and Leonard. But since you aren't a formal member, you can only take 10% of the half. Come over later to sign for it. How much did he pay? Klein asked happily while also feeling the pinch. 200 pounds. This was what he said back then, Lord. The esteemed Storm. I never imagined or believed that this was resolved just like that. This is even harder than us having a dream. Why is your security company so unknown? It's an insult to the entire industry. Mrs. Oriana mimicked the old butler's southern accent. Klein thought seriously for a few seconds before saying humorously, This is just too unfair for those kidnappers. 2 Beyonders had resolved the problem quickly using methods that could be described as easy and pleasant. This is like an adult bullying a few kids while in full combat attire. They were just too unlucky. They must have lost the protection of the divine, said Oriana with a soft laugh. I told the butler that we were only lucky. One of our informants happened to see the kidnappers bring the child into the hideout. Therefore, do not have too much hopes for us. We really are just a very ordinary security company. Typically speaking, the more you emphasize something as ordinary, the more extraordinary it is. Klein lampooned with a smile. He watched Mrs. Oriana walk through the partition and enter the accounting room. Old Neil puckered his lips by the side and said enviously, "You really are a lucky lad. You haven't joined us for long and you've encountered a job worth £200. Is that very rare?" Klein asked in puzzlement. Prior to this, he was either studying history or mysticism, or wandering aimlessly outside, hoping to find clues with his spiritual perception. According to Oriana's accounts, we might not encounter a single job an entire week, and most jobs are worth less than £20. Old Neil rubbed the moonstone by his wrist and sighed following that. He looked at Klein with anticipation. If you encounter any similar jobs in the future, remember to inform me. Upon hearing Old Neil's words, Klein suddenly felt a strange feeling arise in him. Therefore, he asked directly, "Mr. Neil, you seem to be lacking in money. How much do you get paid a week? If you aren't comfortable telling me, just ignore my question." Old Neil leaned back into the sofa and chuckled. "This isn't something that needs hiding. I've been here for so many years. At present, I will obtain salaries from both the church and the police department every week. A total of £12. A weekly salary of £12? Klein blurted out in surprise. A weekly salary of £12 with 52 weeks a year. That meant more than £600 a year. Back when he read the Tianjin Morning Post and Honest Paper, they had mentioned that high-profile lawyers only earned £800 to £1,000 a year, and those were the best lawyers. As for the managers of Benson's trading company, they only earned £6 a week. That was already quite a decent job, yes. Such a salary is actually quite generous, and we do not need to pay any taxes," added Old Neil with a smile. Klein had heard from Benson that one had to pay E-type taxes when their weekly salaries exceeded £1. In other words, the government and corporate employees had to pay 3 of taxes if they earned £1 to £2, 5 for £2 to £5, 10 for £5 to £10, and 15 for £10 to £20, capping at 20 for those above £20. Other than that, he also read of 4 other kinds of taxes on the newspapers. A-type was related to land, housing, and other earnings from material items. It included property and rent. B-type was a tax paid by farmers. C-type was a tax on profits from bonds, funds, and equities. D-type was commercial, finance, or professional income. "It's something admirable," Klein echoed Old Neil. However, Old Neil shook his head. "Such a salary is insufficient for beyonders like us who have to frequently study the hidden mysteries, practice and attempt rituals." "Aren't materials obtainable via application?" asked Klein in puzzlement. Old Neil scoffed. "There's a limitation to it. At times, we have to give a sufficient legitimate reason. If you want to learn more and experiment in the field of mysticism, you can only spend your own dime to buy materials. It can be bought internally or at underground markets." Klein jolted in surprise as he immediately asked, "There are beyonder materials that are sold in underground markets? I thought the churches would not permit their existence." He was lacking in means to obtain materials. With him having a mysterious organization in its nascent stages, he could not always have them settled via the Nighthawks, right? There's no way to control such matters. Yeah, from the viewpoint of mysticism, all beings are sentient with their spirits and they stem from the same source. The materials we use are not limited to those extraordinary creatures. It also comes from ordinary animals, plants, and minerals. For example, the poison hemlock, gold mint leaves, and night vanilla in the bottle of seer potion. They are items we can encounter frequently in our daily lives. They might not have any extraordinary characteristics, but they have special characteristics. Through concoction and blending, they will derive certain effects. Therefore, this is not a trade that the church can ban," explained Old Neil in detail without waiting for Klein to say a word. He continued, "Besides, it's not only the core of extraordinary beings that are of use. For example, the Lavos squid, apart from its blood, its eyeballs, skin, and tentacles are pretty good materials. Unless the church captures it entirely with its own manpower, to completely corner and control any outflows would be a tremendous financial burden. The lower the grade of the extraordinary material, the more it is so. They can only do their best to prevent the more special materials from flowing out." Old Neil suddenly laughed. "There's another important reason. It's better to know of an underground market than not knowing of it. Under the premise that secret organizations have not been fully Eliminated, this is a pretty good strategy. Besides, it can help us obtain materials we are lacking. Of course, with the existence of such markets, contraband items will appear as long as it's not something ridiculous or overly dangerous. We will turn a blind eye to it. At most, we would use them to enrich our vaults. Is it because the few large churches put each other in place so no one can take excessive action? Klein guessed. Old Neil acknowledged tersely but did not elaborate. I'm a seer. In the future, I'll definitely need to practice and will need more materials. Mr. Neil, can you take me to the underground market to have a look? Klein requested with a valid reason. Old Neil appeared to be placed in a difficult position. In fact, those guys who are active in those places are mostly not beyonders. Some of them might be aristocrats that like mystery or rich people who have inclinations towards mysticism. Alright, I have a 30-pound bill that needs paying soon. It wouldn't be convenient for me to head over there for the time being. Alright. Klein never expected the reason to be Old Neil's owing of money moments. Later, he said with deliberation, Mr. Neil, do you need me to lend you money? I just earned a commission of 10 pounds. Haha, there's no need. You'll be able to settle it. Old Neil patted the sofa and slowly stood up. Sigh, age is truly an enemy that biological creatures can't fight. I'm exhausted from last night's watch, yeah. Revise what I've taught you later this morning. Read more documents. Tomorrow, I'll teach you the foundations of ritualistic magic. Alright, Klein got up and bade him farewell by taking off his hat. When Captain Dunn did not return at noon, Klein pretended that he was still searching for the notebook as he roamed the streets again. Having earned 10 pounds, he no longer needed to wait for the next disbursement of the funds. He could head directly to the divination club. Cogitation and spirit vision have been occasionally producing murmurings and illusions. It made him eager to begin acting. Chapter 48. In the divination club situated at the second floor of 13 House Street, Northborough of Tingen City, Klein saw the beautiful lady that attended to visitors once again. She was still having her brownish-yellow long hair coiled, making her look mature and elegant. It was hard to tell her age. Hello, Mr. Glassy isn't here today. Would you like to change fortune tellers today? Said the beautiful lady with a smile. Upon hearing that, Klein, who had just taken off his silk hat and put it back on, was immediately surprised. You still remember me? That was already 5 days ago. The woman puckered her lips into a smile. You are the first customer that sought Mr. Glass's services. You are also the only one to this very day. It's hard for me not to have a deep impression of you. Was this the image of him being Pennywise? Pound foolish, Klein lampooned himself as he deliberated a question. When was the last time Mr. Glassy came to the club? The lady shot a glance at him and answered seemingly in recollection. To be honest, we are unable to grasp when our members will come and go. They have their free will and personal matters to tend to. Well, I do believe that Mr. Glassy hasn't come to the club since he told your fortune that day. I wish him the best of luck. May the goddess bless him. Klein prayed and did not ask further. Instead, he asked with a smile, I'm not here for divination services this time. I plan to join the club. Really? That's our pleasure. The lady expressed a timely look of surprised delight. For the first year as a member, the membership fee is £5. It will be £1 a year thereafter. I believe there's no need for me to describe in the details again. Klein took out a £5 note he recently received as he watched Henry Augustus's portrait depart him. After seriously checking the anti-counterfeit watermark, the woman stored away the note seriously and handed a form to Klein. Please fill in your detailed information. Let me prepare the receipt for you. There's a receipt? You should bill it to Blackthorn Security Company. Klein was amused by his own thoughts as he picked up a fountain pen on the desk. With the blackish-blue ink, he filled in his name, age, address, and company information. However, he had deliberately left his date of birth empty to a seer that provided profound mysteries about his body through his life path number. After receiving the receipt and finishing his registration as a member, the lady extended her right hand. Congratulations on joining Tingen City's Divination Club. I'm Angelica Barhart, your hardworking server. This is your member cufflinks. There are special inscriptions on them which will identify you as a member. Hello, Madam Angelica. Klein shook her hand and took the dark gold cufflinks. He realized that the special inscription was written with the root word for fortune teller in Hermes. Angelica retracted her left hand and thought for a few seconds. Might I ask what divination arts you are most familiar with? Or would you prefer to learn some divination methods from the club? We will consider inviting famous fortune tellers of the corresponding domain to give classes. We will also introduce you members with similar expertise so that you can have a good time interacting with them. I know a bit of every divination art. There's no need to give me any special considerations, Klein replied with some embellishments. In addition, he inquired, can I begin telling the fortunes of others? And not a total rookie, he was here to act as a seer and not learn the divination methods ordinary people could learn. Angelica maintained a polite smile as she said, "You can tell the fortunes of people anytime in the club, however. Before we confirm your skills, we will not promote you when our customers ask, how much do you plan on charging for your fortune-telling?" 2 pence, Klein decided to gain an advantage with price while he was still unknown. "We will go by the standard of taking an eighth, so we will be taking a 1/4 pence for fees." Angelica repeated the various rules first before writing Klein's information into the fortune teller album which customers could choose from. After all of this was done, she pointed at the meeting room at the far end of the corridor with a smile. "Mr. Hannes Vincent is currently explaining astrolabe divination. You can find a quiet spot to listen in. You can also raise your questions if there are any queries." "All right." Klein walked toward the meeting room with his interest piqued. He wanted to know the differences between what Hannes Vincent and old Neil said at that moment. Angelica chased up and whispered, "Mr. Moretti, would you want coffee or tea? We provide side black tea, Southville coffee, and Desi coffee." Klein, who had been reading the papers regularly, knew that these coffees and black tea were considered as one of the inferior varieties. But he also knew that they were definitely of better quality than the ones he had at home. After some thought, he said, "A cup of Southville coffee, 3 teaspoons of sugar without milk, please." Lone Kingdom's Southville was famous for its beer and red wine. Many important figures were fond of them. However, their coffee was relatively unknown. "All right, I'll send it to you in a bit." Angelica pointed towards the meeting room. Klein slowly walked to the half-closed door and heard a voice in a thick Awa accent explaining. Astrolabe divination is a relatively more complex one among the divination arts, but that's only for ordinary people. Klein silently tagged on a sentence for the speaker. He saw about 5 tables placed in a circle inside the meeting room. It surrounded a middle-aged man. In a black classic robe, Hannes Vincent, the gentleman had obvious dark circles. His brown hair was thick and hard. Each strand stood firmly like a porcupine's spikes. Apart from that, there was nothing unique about him. Upon seeing Klein enter, Hannes Vincent nodded gently without stopping his class. He only slowed down his speech. Klein had one hand in his pocket while the other held his cane. He found a seat to the sides and sat down, leaning back comfortably in the process. He scanned the circle of 6 members. There were 4 men and 2 women. Some of them were attentively taking notes, whispering, or returning Klein a rueful smile after placing his cane down. Klein adjusted his half-top hat and tapped his glabella twice in the process. He cast his gaze at Hannes and saw the different colors, brightness, and thickness of his aura. Dark red. "He's a little worried. Actually, every other part of his body is healthy except that part. I wonder what's wrong." Klein listened to the class while muttering to himself. At that moment, he clasped his right hand and covered his mouth to prevent his laughter from sounding. He suddenly felt like he was a quack. He was rather pleased with his spirit vision ability. Although he could only make a general judgment and not the details, it was enough to gain him many useful information. After surveying his surroundings, he tapped his glabella twice again as though he was pondering over what Hannes had just said. Astrolabe divination was one of the astromancy divination methods. However, ordinary people could also attempt to interpret things. For instance, the most basic birth horoscope was to determine the inquirer's fate by determining the positions of the sun, moon, blue and red stars at their birth, the corresponding spots in the sky, matching the representative symbols to the astrolabe, and the corresponding situations of the different constellations. This required the fortune teller to be able to calculate the states of the planets and constellations, which was rather complicated, of course. There were publications that aided people to look up the values. Some even simplified it. By making a vague read with just the constellations, Klein listened silently without interjecting or asking any questions. From time to time, he would caress the hanging topaz at his sleeve or take a sip of the Southville coffee which Angelica had brought in. After some time, Hannes rubbed his glabella and said, "Perhaps you will need to attempt at creating your own astrolabe. Ask me if you have any questions. I will be in Moonstone." After he left, a young man in a white shirt and black vest got up with a smile and walked to Klein's side. "Nice to meet you. I'm Edward Steve. My pleasure. I'm Klein Moretti." Klein stood up and returned the bow. "Astrolabes are too complicated. Every time I hear about it, I can't help but doze off," said Edward self-deprecatingly. Klein grinned and said, "That's because Mr. Vincent can't help but pass the knowledge he grasps to us. It's like giving us an Intis feast. It's just indigestible. I'd be able to finish the Intis feast. They usually use a huge plate to serve tiny bits of food." Edward chuckled and sat up. He asked out of curiosity, "Are you new?" I've not seen you in the 2 years I was here. I just joined the club today, answered Klein frankly. What are you good at? I'm best at tarot and poker divination, Edward casually asked. I know a little of everything, but just a little. Klein gave a description he used to give himself. He was not being modest since there was just too much mysterious knowledge he had not grasped in the domain of divination. Just as the other members were thinking of talking about horoscope divination, Angelica walked into the meeting room. Mr. Steve, someone wants you to tell their fortunes. All right, Edward stood up with a smile. I can tell you are an excellent fortune teller, said Klein as he looked at him. No, it's because my price is most suitable, said Edward with a soft chortle. When ordinary people come to have their fortunes told, they will absolutely not choose the most expensive ones, and unless they had their heads kicked by asses, they would definitely not be choosing the cheapest few. It's easiest to gain opportunities if you are in the middle, in one of those that had their heads kicked by asses. When he saw Edward leave, Klein suddenly shook his head with a wry smile. It seems the price I set is problematic. He stood up, picked up his cane, and left the meeting room. He found Angelica again. I wish to change the prices of my divination, set it to 8 pence. Angelica took a deep look at him and said, we will satisfy your request, but we will also tell customers that you only recently joined the club. No problem. Klein did not mind as he nodded. At times, mystery was also an important element for a seer. To attract customers, after changing his details, Klein returned to the meeting room. At that moment, he saw Hannes Vincent walk out of Moonstone. He held a silver-coated mirror. This well-known fortune teller said to the 5 members in the meeting room, I recently learned a new divination art, magic mirror divination. Does anyone want to learn? Magic mirror divination? That's not safe. Klein paused outside the meeting room and frowned. Chapter 49. As a seer who had just stepped through the gates of mysticism, Klein did not dare to claim he knew much. However, he was certain he knew more than ordinary people. He was aware that the various kinds of divination arts could be split into 3 categories based on particular standards, and that standard was based on the source of the revelation. The first category of divination included tarot, poker, pendulums, dowsing canes, and dreams. By using the inquirer's own spirituality and its communication with the spirit world to gain a revelation, it could be interpreted for an answer. However, spirit pendulums and dowsing canes had very high requirements of one's spirituality, spirit body, and astral projection. Non-beyonders were unable to obtain precise or clear revelations. Card divination provided fixed symbolism, presenting even an average person's faint revelation. Dreams were somewhere in between the other forms. The second category included spirit numerology and astromancy, as well as their derived forms. The fortune teller used either the personal details of the inquirer or changes in nature before using calculations, inference, and interpretation to answer their questions. With this method, the initiative did not lie in the inquirer, but the fortune teller. The third category used an external third party, separate from the inquirer and the fortune teller. The Ouija boards that Klein was familiar with from his previous life belonged in this category. They used rituals to ask for a direct answer from the unknown or the supernatural. Even though there was a high chance that an average person would not succeed, there were cases where they managed to communicate with malicious spirits or entities that drove them to insanity. These methods of divination usually led to tragedies. The magic mirror divination that Hannes Vincent mentioned belonged to the third category. In mysticism, mirrors were connected to the unknown and mystery like they were the doors of the spiritual world. Thus, Klein stopped outside the meeting room. Intending to learn how the famous fortune teller would explain the divination, Klein wanted to ascertain if he needed to inform the captain or not, raiding him at night. Of course, there was a safe way to do the magic mirror divination. One could ask for answers from the 7 orthodox divinities. Even if it was very difficult for an ordinary person to receive any real revelations, they would not be in any danger or suffer any after effects. The magic mirror divinations that were strictly controlled by the Nighthawks and mandated punishers were those that asked evil gods or mysterious existences for help. Furthermore, the fortune teller couldn't randomly fabricate things. Some phrases or qualities had the potential to invite the attention of unknown entities. In the world where the powers of the Beyonders exist, such divinations would often lead to tragedy. Klein even suspected that the original Klein, Welch, and Naya had committed such a forbidden divination by following the instructions of the Antigonus family's diary. At that moment, Hannes also explained the principle behind magic mirror divination and described the actual process. First, you choose a suitable time and date according to the divinity you believe in. You can decide this using the astromancy manual. For example, we all know that Sundays symbolize the Evernight goddess, for Sunday is the embodiment of rest. 2 to 3 in the early morning, 9 to 10 in the morning, 4 to 5 in the evening, and 11 to midnight are all related to the moon, thus they are controlled by the Evernight goddess. Thus, fortune-tellers that pray to the Evernight goddess can use magic mirror divination during these times on a Sunday. Quite a good foundation, Klein nodded slightly while using the half-closed door to the meeting room to conceal himself. It had to be said that with the 7 major churches keeping each other in check, some mysticism knowledge had indeed leaked. For example, many of the meanings behind the symbolism could be found in the astromancy manual. However, without the potions or beyonder powers, ordinary people were unable to obtain the desired effects. Second, we must scrutinize the mirror carefully. It must be a mirror coated with silver. You place the mirror at the position representing the moon. Hanas demonstrated with the prop in his hand. No, what he needs now is spirit dowsing. First, choose a position and recite the phrase. This place is suitable for magic mirror divination 7 times in your head, then see which direction the pendulum turns, clockwise for true, counterclockwise for false. Of course, if you are asking for answers from a malicious supernatural entity, the position would not matter, rather, it would depend on whether the entity is interested in answering your questions. Klein silently corrected him. At this point, he felt like a teacher listening in on a lesson. Hanas Vincent could not hear Klein's mental musings as he described the preparations in detail in a normal tone. When the members finished taking notes, he continued explaining. After showering, confirm that you have drawn all your curtains and locked your doors. After that, light up a candle and place it in front of the mirror. Before sincerely praying to the divinity you believe in, try to keep your questions simple as there's no need for fanciful embellishment. After praying 7 times, pick up your mirror and gently toss it on the ground. Make sure to be gentle. Remember the way it shatters, as that is a revelation from the gods. I will tell you the main symbolisms in a second. Phew, this is orthodox magic mirror divination. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he walked into the meeting room and sat back down in his previous seat. He finished the rest of his Southville coffee in one gulp. So-called orthodox divination meant that it was possible to obtain revelations, but it was impossible to truly interpret it, and for beyonders who reached this step, they could look straight into the mirror to obtain clear information if they received a response. As there were many potential symbolisms after the shattering, Hanas taught for a long while. He was not done even when Edward Steve returned to the room after finishing his fortune-telling. Klein did not ask what Edward did for his fortune-telling or what method did he use, since it was an unspoken rule among fortune-tellers. While acting as a seer, he naturally had to abide by it strictly unless the other party mentioned it. I discovered that many a time, our interpretation is too vague, as though it's meeting different requests, allowing different people to find a description of themselves from the interpretation. Edward drank a mouthful of black tea and said with a soft sigh, for example, those that encounter adversities and calamities will eventually see the light of hope. Hehe, but no one knows when the light of hope will come. For example, a journey might not be very smooth sailing, but you will definitely arrive alive. Hehe. The dead will not retort me, as he did not listen from the beginning. He ignored Hannah's magic mirror divination class. Survival bias, added Klein with a smile. Survival bias generally meant that a lot of statistics would only include those who were alive and lucky. The data would ignore the dead. Therefore, the results would be clearly biased, right? Emperor Roselle was really a philosopher, marveled Edward, speechless. Klein raised his empty cup and pretended to take a sip. The members were fully immersed in the study of horoscopes and magic mirror divination the entire afternoon. Occasionally, they would also discuss with Klein and Edward, and when that happened, Klein would try his best to meet his duty as an informal member of the Nighthawks. He would try hard to steer the topic away from anything related to beyonders or dangerous ideas. However, he failed at the thing he wanted to do the most. A few inquirers came, but none of them picked him to do their fortune-telling. Perhaps I have to be more proactive in entertaining them. Should I use a few phrases like "you are plagued with bad luck," "you have been unlucky recently," or "nothing you do will happen smoothly"? No, that's nothing like a seer. With this in mind, Klein could not help but shake his head in self-deprecation. He picked up his cane, stood up, and left after bidding everyone farewell at 5:30. Edward Steve put on his coat and was prepared to walk out the divination club when he suddenly saw a familiar figure. "Good afternoon, Glassy, long time no see," he greeted with a smile. He saw his friend with similar interests as him wear his usual format suit with a black bow tie in front of his chest hung a monocle. Immediately following that, he noticed that his friend did not look well. Even his soft blonde hair looked dry. "Good afternoon, Edward." Cough. Glassy, with his hat in hand, suddenly used his fist to cover his mouth as he coughed a few times. Edward asked out of concern, "You seem to be ill?" A very serious illness, it even turned into pneumonia. If it wasn't for my wife who met an impressive apothecary and gave me a magical medicine, you would have probably had to visit me at the cemetery. Glass's tone was filled with a lingering fear and joy. Lord, I can't believe it, you were so healthy previously, look at you, you look so frail now. I remember when I did divination on you, there were no signs that indicated that you would get a serious illness. Edward waved his cane and said with an astonished sigh, my own divination had the same result as yours. Perhaps we are not qualified fortune tellers. Besides, Glassy suddenly recalled the happenings on Monday as his expression turned abnormally serious. At that moment, the beautiful lady, Angelica, came over and bowed with a pleasant smile. After exchanging greetings, she first showed concern for Glass's health and provided some suggestions. Then she mentioned in passing, Mr. Glassy, Mr. Moretti, who requested your divination services previously, has joined our club as well, the one who got me to tell his fortune? Glass's eyes lit up immediately. Lord, where's he? He just left. Angelica and Edward were unable to comprehend Glass's abnormal reaction. Glassy took 2 steps in agitation and said, the next time he comes, please ask him when he will come if I'm not around. Glassy, what happened? Did that Mr. Klein Moretti do something to you? Asked Edward in puzzlement. Glassy raised his arm and stared straight into Edward's and Angelica's probing gazes. He said in excitement, he's a very, very, very magical. He lowered his arm and said after using very thrice, Doctor. Chapter 50. 7:30 in the evening, around the Moretti family's dining table. Klein, why do you need to be at work so early as a consultant? Would emergency matters at the security company be more dangerous? Benson forked a potato from a dish of potato stewed beef as he raised the matter in concern. Klein carefully spat out the bones from a pan-fried dish and gave his prepared answer. A batch of historical documents needed immediate shipping to Backlund. I had to be present to handle the handover and make sure there was nothing missing. As you can guess, the bunch of fist-swinging bastards don't know any face sack. Upon hearing his answer, Benson, who had finished chewing his food, could not help but sigh. Knowledge is truly important. Making use of this opportunity, Klein took out the remaining £5 note and handed it to Benson. This is my additional payment I received today. It's time you get some decent clothes too. £5? Benson and Melissa said in unison. Benson took the note and looked at it repeatedly. He said in both shock and doubt, this security company sure is generous. His weekly salary was £1.10 solely, which meant £6 exactly every 4 weeks. He only earned £1 additional from this additional payment. And with that salary, he had managed to support his siblings, giving them a decent place to stay and allowing them to eat meat 2 to 3 times a week. Every year, they could get a few new clothes. Are you doubting me? Klein deliberately returned with a question. Benson chuckled. I doubt you have the ability nor the guts to rob a bank. You aren't someone who can lie, Melissa answered seriously after lowering her fork and knife. I am now someone used to lying. Klein immediately felt a little ashamed, although it was a result of the circumstances of his reality. His sister's belief in him left him melancholic. It was relatively urgent and important today. I also played a crucial role. Which is the reason for the £5, Klein explained. In a way, what he said was the truth. As for the £5 that he would be reimbursed with, the one he would use to join the divination club, planned on concealing it. Firstly, if he brought £5 home again, he would truly scare his siblings, making them suspect he was doing something illegal. Secondly, he had to save to buy additional materials to practice being a seer and to grasp more mysticism knowledge. Benson bit off a mouthful of wheat bread in satisfaction and thought for more than 10 seconds. The work it doesn't need any decent clothes. Well, to be precise, the clothes at home are sufficient. Without waiting for Klein to persuade him, he suggested, with this additional income, we would truly have savings. I plan on buying a few books on accountancy and studying. Klein, Melissa, I do not wish that my weekly salary remain below £2 in 5 years. As you know, my boss and manager have shit for brains. Their mouths stink. The moment they open them. Excellent idea, agreed Klein. He also took the opportunity to steer the conversation. Why don't you read some of the grammar books in my room? To be truly dignified and to earn a handsome pay. That's something rather critical perhaps. In the times to come, the civil servant examinations will appear in Lone Kingdom. Preparing ahead of time would give him the advantage. Benson's eyes lit up when he heard that. I've indeed forgotten about that. Here, let's toast to a beautiful future. He did not drink rye beer. Instead, he poured clear oyster soup into 3 cups and clinked his cup with his siblings. After drinking the clear soup, he looked at his sister who was wrestling with the pan-fried fish. He chuckled and said, aside from Benson's books, I think Melissa needs a new dress too. Melissa looked up and shook her head incessantly. No, I think it's best. To save it up, Klein finished the sentence for her. Yeah, Melissa nodded in agreement. In fact, if you do not seek the best fabrics and the newest designs, it would not be too expensive. We can save up the remaining money, said Klein in a manner which did not allow for disagreement. Benson added, Melissa, are you planning on wearing the old dress again to Selena's 16th birthday bash? Selena Wood was Melissa's classmate and good friend. She came from quite a good family background. Her elder brother was a practicing solicitor, and her father was a senior employee of Backlund Bank's Tingen branch. However, the so-called bash was only a dinner invitation to friends where they chatted and played cards. All right, Melissa lowered her head and mumbled a response. Then, she ruthlessly forked a piece of stewed beef. After a short silence, she suddenly recalled something and looked up. Abruptly, Mrs. Shoud from next door got her maidservant to send a calling card over. She wishes to make a formal visit on Sunday. At 4 in the afternoon tomorrow, she wants to get to know her new neighbors. Mrs. Shoud? Klein looked at his siblings. Confounded. Benson rapped the side of the table with his fingers and appeared to be thinking. Mrs. Shoud from 4 Daffodil Street? I met her husband before. He's a senior solicitor. Senior solicitor. Perhaps he knows Selena's brother, said Melissa with some hints of delight. We are at 2 Daffodil Street. Klein nodded slightly. It's imperative we get to know our neighbors, but as you know, I still have to be at the company on Sunday. I only have time off on Monday. Please pass my apologies to Mrs. Shoud. With that said, he suddenly recalled the neighbors of his former life when he was young, as well as the neighbors in the apartment from Iron Cross Street. He was amused as he sighed lightly to have formal visits. Shouldn't neighbors get to know each other through natural interaction? Ha, Klein, that's because you aren't aware. You have read a lot of newspapers recently, but you have not broached the magazines catered towards families and middle-aged women. They placed families with an annual income of £100 to £1,000 as middle class. They promoted it as the framework of the entire kingdom and praised how the middle class doesn't have the arrogance of the aristocrats and the wealthy, nor are they as crass as the low-income brackets. Benson lightly and happily explained, these magazines impart many simplified ceremonies which the aristocrats practice in their interactions. As such, it becomes a target of the middle class. Thus, this results in the differences between intimate calls, semi-formal calls, and formal calls. As he spoke, he shook his head and chuckled. Typically, gentlemen, madams, and ladies who view themselves in this class will be very particular about details. They will visit their neighbors and friends from 2 to 6 in the afternoon. It's known as a morning call. One morning call? Klein and Melissa asked in surprise. Why was a visit from 2 to 6 in the afternoon a morning call? Benson put down his fork and knife, threw his hands up, and smiled. I do not know why either. All I did was read the magazines my female colleague brought. Yeah, perhaps it's because they wear their morning gowns to make the call. Morning gowns were a form of formal attire worn during mass or gatherings. Later, it was considered as formal attire for the day, different from the formal attire for evening functions. All right. Remember to buy some good coffee powder and tea leaves in the afternoon. Buy some muffins and lemon egg tarts from Mrs. Smyron. We must not ill-treat our neighbors. Klein chuckled as he dipped his remaining bread into the meat sauces, grabbed some potato and put it into his mouth. The next morning was a Sunday morning. Klein finished the last mouthful of inferior tea, put down the newspapers, and wore his half-top hat, picking up his silver-inlaid black cane. He sauntered out the door and took a public carriage to Zutland Street. He greeted Rosen, who was planning to sleep in the break room after finishing her night duty, after which he went all the way down to the basement. After turning a corner, he met a Nighthawk member, sleepless royal-ridden. She looked like a cold lady. Her brows were long and slender, sitting atop large eyes. Her hair was a silky smooth black. Good morning, Madame Radine. Klein greeted with a smile. Royale used her deep blue eyes to glance at him and nodded indiscernibly in return. The two quickly passed by each other. When Royale stopped and said with her eyes trained forward, "Ritualistic magic is a very dangerous thing, Klein was taken aback. By the time he turned around, all he saw was her departing back. Thank you. He frowned and shouted at Royale Riadine's back. After taking a left band, he quickly met old Neil inside the armory, as well as Brett, who should not have been there. Let's go to my place. I've already received the corresponding materials. Brett has agreed to watch the armory for me, said old Neil with a chuckle. Klein was immediately surprised. We aren't doing it here? Old Neil held a silver chest and tooted. There's no space here to practice ritualistic magic. Klein did not ask further. He followed old Neil up to the streets and took a public carriage to the North Boroughs suburbs. Old Neil's place was a bungalow. The garden in front of it was filled with roses, golden mint and other materials. The moment he entered, there was a carpeted foyer. There were 2 high-back chairs and an umbrella rack. Through the foyer was an expansive living room. The walls were plastered with light-colored wallpaper. The floors were a dark brown color. In the middle of the room was a tiny carpet with floral imprints, and placed above it was a heavy round table. Surrounding the table were comfortable long benches, single-seaters, and a piano. My deceased wife loved music. Old Neil pointed at the piano and mentioned in passing, the sofa and coffee table are in the bedrooms. Let's do the ritualistic magic in the living room. All right, Klein replied cautiously. After Old Neil put down the silver chest, he laughed and said, let me demonstrate to you ritualistic magic. Make sure to observe and remember the ritual. As he spoke, he took out a fake goatskin parchment from the chest. It was specially made and it had strange pictures drawn on it with black ink that exuded a serene fragrance. Klein kept watching and finally discovered that Old Neil was seemingly likely, possibly drawing an IOU. When Old Neil filled in the corresponding field with the number 30 and the corresponding symbol, Klein could not help but ask out of puzzlement and confusion, Mr. Neil, what kind of ritualistic magic are you doing? Old Neil coughed and answered very seriously, you'll be using magic to settle that debt of £30 today. You can do that. Klein's eyes widened as his mouth gaped.